My name is Connie Persike, like Tim said. I am a speech pathologist by trade, and I had the pleasure of working in a school for kids with autism as my very first job. Coming out of graduate school, fell in love with that population of students. We probably had the kiddos that had more significant externalizing behaviors. That's why they were at our school. The school districts couldn't support their needs. And I did that for about 5 years. And just like I said, fell in love with behavior, fell in love with autism, and have been in the school settings in a different way, shape, or form for the past 20 years. So today I'm going to talk about anxiety and autism spectrum disorder, how we can help out at school, what it might look like. Let's see, I'm left-handed, so this is going to be interesting. I've just got to switch. That's okay. But I live in a right-handed world, so I can't use my left hand for that. All right.
Thank you for accommodating us.
Yes, you're welcome. All right. So in my presentation, I am using identity-first language, which is recommended per the guidance of the APA style manual. I will tell you, though, I'm in a habit of using people-first language when I talk. So while my writing may say autistic students, I'm not going to promise I can do that the whole presentation. I may be saying students with autism, just out of pure habit. But there's a real push in the autism community that, autism is nothing to be ashamed of, and that's a part of their identity. So there's a big push to use identity-first language. So today, we are gonna talk about, oh, my joke didn't get in there. I have to start with a joke, and I took a picture in the bathroom. For those of you that are on site, there is a visual right above the lock in the bathroom that shows how the lock door looks. So it has a picture of unlocked and a picture of locked, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is a perfect example of an anxiety decreasing strategy, because I don't know how many of you guys, but I'm definitely someone who will go to the bathroom that I'm not familiar with, and then I start to panic, like, did I lock the door? Is it locked? Is it not locked? And I have to lock it a couple times to make sure. Well, here at the Weissman Center, they have visual supports for that. It is amazing. I added it on my phone, but it didn't make it it didn't transfer over the cloud. But what a great strategy. It's a perfect example of ways we can help decrease people's anxiety. Anyway, today, we're going to talk about some prevalence rates in autistic students. I'm probably going to skip over most of that because Martha did an awesome job there's a little bit of overlap in what Martha and I are going to be talking about, so I'll just kind of skip or go through those a little bit more quickly. Recognizing the signs of anxiety in students with autism in the school setting, what we can look for, why we need to be looking for clues, and then some instructional practices that we can use to help all people who exhibit anxiety, but especially help people with autism. And then I'm going to talk to you about just a few for time's sake. And Tim took some of my time, and I always need as much time as I can get. But I picked out a few strategies that are both top-down strategies and bottom-up strategies and top-down strategies that can help people with anxiety kind of get through their day, and some coping strategies that Kimberly was talking about. So, prevalence rates. I thought this was a really powerful quote that Temple Grandin often says. The principal emotion experienced by autistic people is fear. And for those of you who haven't watched The Sensory Funnel by Asperger experts, I would encourage you to do so. It's on YouTube. But he talks about that also, that the prime emotion people with autism feel is fear, and he even says like terror, because they're trying to fit into a world that doesn't meet their needs. And so, especially when it comes to sensory needs. So, the reference again. The question was to repeat the reference. The reference is The Sensory Funnel. It's a YouTube video, and I can't remember the man's name, but he runs a channel called the Asperger's Experts. So, and he talks about that too. So, when it comes to prevalence rates, Martha talked a lot about the actual percentages being a wide range depending on the studies that you look at. Most commonly, they reference about 40 to 50% of students with autism have at least one diagnosable anxiety disorder. But this I thought was really interesting. Parents often report that anxiety impacts their children with autism more than autism itself. And there's a strong correlation between autism symptoms and anxiety symptoms. So the higher the anxiety is, the higher the symptoms of autism. Those symptoms of autism can become more prevalent as anxiety exists. So why is the prevalence? We talked a lot, like Tim said, over our break here, that there's a big part of the prevalence rate for anxiety could be that we are trying to we are not as a culture, not accepting of differences as we maybe ought to be. So just somebody with a lot of differences trying to fit into this world is going to produce anxiety. Is it about anxiety in themselves, or is it about living in this world that's not as accepting? And I think there's a big push at the state level with the Department of Public Instruction pushing out their neurodiversity trainings and moving away from disability-labeled trainings. But how can we support the needs of all kids, no matter what they look like and all of their differences, and accept those? So I think we're getting there, but we're not there yet. We're at least having the conversation. But also, there's a strong evidence base for intense responsivity to sensory stimuli, especially as young kids. If you're more responsive to sensory stimuli in your environment, then you're going to have a stronger sense of fear and anxiety. Even if you have autism or in the general public, if you have sensory needs, especially if you're sensitive to sound and touch, you're going to be more likely to have an anxiety disorder or be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder in the future, especially if those go untreated. So we want to definitely be noticing those sensory differences and providing supports around them. Okay, so task frustration. A lot of our students with autism have difficulty understanding abstract language, have difficulty with reading comprehension. We're not always giving them the modifications that they might need right away. So to be given that work from the get-go without the modifications, that's going to spike their anxiety right away upon presentation. So being aware of that and trying to really differentiate their needs is going to help us. Rigidity is a characteristic of autism, and so having difficulty with transitions, having difficulty if something doesn't go the way you think it should, having a hard time with change, all of those things are going to produce more anxiety and fear in somebody who already struggles with that. So that's why the prevalence rate could be higher in this population. Communication differences. For the students who struggle with communication or as a young child needed more visuals to help them communicate, their early experience in life has been that people don't understand them. So I see this often, even once we get an alternative communication system in place, those kids have an underlying, or those students have an underlying sense of anxiety around whether or not they're being understood. So it's really important that we acknowledge their communication attempts, let them know that we've heard them, let them know that we understand them so that we can ease some of that. Also in our students that are more verbal and are able to communicate, there's a strong correlation of word finding difficulties or retrieval difficulties in people with autism. And so that's kind of the chicken or the egg, what comes first? Does the anxiety cause them to have a hard time retrieving words, or their difficulty retrieving words, does that cause anxiety? I don't think we really have an answer for that, but think about how you would feel if you were in the classroom setting, you get called on unexpectedly, you know the answer, but you can't find the words to use to answer that. That's pretty anxiety producing. Almost every single student that I've evaluated for word finding difficulties have a lot of anxiety in the school setting also. There's a strong correlation there. So communication difficulties definitely can be a part of the reason that there's a prevalence for anxiety in students with autism. Social differences. I'll never forget my first IEP with a mom who had very flat affect. I couldn't read her facial expressions. I didn't know what she was thinking. I became a blubbering idiot. Like, I'm thinking in my head, like, is she mad at me? Is she okay with what I'm saying? Does she like my proposal? What's going on? And so when you think about people with autism, they have a really hard time understanding what other people are thinking and feeling and their perspective on the world. And if you go through the world like that, that can be very fatiguing and very anxiety producing if you can't read someone's facial expression to know what they're saying. Also for social differences, and I think Kimberly alluded to this, like, oftentimes, especially if kids get older and their awareness increases, they have a hard time, in a social situation, they know it's not going well, but they can't put their finger on exactly why, and that can produce a lot of anxiety also. So those are some of the reasons the prevalence rates are high. I'm not going to talk about this in my 45 minutes. I think I have 15 minutes now. No, I have a half hour. My half an hour today, but it's really why we have to make sure we focus on optimizing the therapies around these skills also. And Martha alluded to that too. Beyond just addressing anxiety, we want to make sure our therapies and our supports and the services we're providing students are beefing up these skills also, because just by doing so, we're going to help decrease some of the anxiety that exists. And during our break, we were also talking, this is such a fine balancing act, because so many students with autism bring so many joy to people, and they have such great strengths. We don't want to change who they are, but we want to help them in those social situations so that so that their peers are accepting. I mean, it's twofold. We need to be teaching the environment and the other students how to accept their differences and welcome them and embrace them and celebrate them, but we also want to be teaching some of these skills so that they're not constantly struggling in those situations. Okay. So, why we need clues. Recognizing anxiety in our students can be really hard in the school setting for many reasons. And so one of them is a lot of kids with autism, or a lot of students with autism, don't have the vocabulary of the emotional vocabulary yet. They might have happy, sad, mad, but when it comes to worried, anxious, nervous, those are higher level emotional vocabulary words. And so a lot of our students might not have that yet to be able to tell us that and explain that to us in a way that we typically would be hearing from other kids. Even if they have those words and that vocabulary, as they get more anxious and they climb that anxiety curve, they are going to lose that skill to be able to tell us that. So when our mind starts to feel anxious, our body gets ready to fight. It gets ready to protect ourselves. It gets ready to either fight, flee, or freeze. When that happens, all the blood flow goes to the downstairs brain, as Dan Siegel coined the term. So we have a downstairs brain. Downstairs brain is responsible for our fight-flight. It's responsible for survival. It's responsible for emotions. And as a student gets anxious, all the blood flow to their brain is going to be going to that area. So the upstairs brain, which is responsible for communicating, responding to language, answering questions, problem solving, rationalizing, that's going offline. As soon as the trigger happens that causes the anxiety, that upstairs brain is starting to work less efficiently. So even if you have a student who has that vocabulary in an isolated setting in their speech and language classroom, at home, they might not have it in the school when anxiety starts to rise. So that could be why we need to watch some of our students' skills and their body and what they're doing to try to determine if there's anxiety existing. I also think it's really important for us to remember that as students learn social and emotional skills, there's a shade of knowing, which we totally understand when it comes to academics, when it comes to reading, when it comes to math. And actually, Fontes and Pinnell created the shades of knowing when it came to literacy knowledge, starting from not knowing the skill yet, to flexibly knowing it and it being habituated or integrated into your life. We get that when it comes to academics. We get that maybe a child can read a word in isolation but not read it in a book yet. But we have a really hard time understanding that when it comes to social emotional skills. So keep that in mind, that even if your child has or your student has calming strategies in the one-on-one setting, it doesn't mean that they can go and use that in the cafeteria when their anxiety is starting to be high or when they're dysregulated. I hear it all the time, but they had it yesterday. They could do it in my speech and language room. They could do it in the classroom. That just means they're learning it. It might not be fully mastered yet. So that's another reason we need to be watching our students and looking for clues of anxiety. So Martha went through a lot of these already. I'm not going to repeat them, but there's behavioral, your body responds to anxiety through behavior and through physical symptoms. So some of the behaviors I see a lot: perfectionism, avoidance, being afraid of making a mistake, a couple that I forgot to put on here. Looking for a predictable response. If you see a student looking for a predictable response, you can probably beg to differ that there's some anxiety existing in their life. And if I do something and I know everybody's going to respond in this specific way, then that's going to ease my anxiety momentarily. I just observed a little girl, a middle school, she's not little, a middle school girl that needed pictures to communicate. She had a few words when it came to being able to echo them and speak in maybe one-word phrases. And as the end of the day came by, I could tell her anxiety was getting higher. She was repetitively asking for home. She didn't really know when that was going to happen. And that was raising her anxiety. And so in her last class of the day, she started rocking more, and she started lifting her shirt up so that the teacher would say, "Put your shirt down." And so it was this nice, predictable response that would happen. She would lift her shirt, the teacher would say, "Put your shirt down," and she would feel better momentarily. So if you're seeing things like that, that could also be a sign that, whoa, this child might need some, structures put in place to help ease their anxiety. Also asking for reassurance. Another elementary school student I just observed, he was continually saying, "Am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get grounded? Am I going to get in trouble?" And his teacher thought he was wanting to experience what trouble felt like. And I said, no, I think he might be feeling some anxiety about whether or not he's doing the right thing, and he's looking for some reassurance at that point. He doesn't want to get in trouble. He wants to do the right thing. He doesn't want to experience that, but he's not sure exactly what the right thing is. So that can be another sign that we see in kids. We're going to talk more about this avoidance and school refusal and classroom refusal, because I'm seeing more and more and more of that in students, especially as they get into middle and high school. Okay, physical symptoms. Our body responds also physically to anxiety through a variety of different, increased urination, students having more accidents at school, bathrooming accidents. All of that is in response to our fight-flight system kicking in, sweating, muscle tension, dizziness, racing heart. I'm not going to read through all of them, but those are some things, especially for our students who maybe rely more heavily on visuals to communicate and to understand language. If we can watch for more of these physical symptoms, maybe we can start having those discussions on whether anxiety is playing a role in the students' programming. I do have to make a statement of, you do not want to be jumping to the conclusion that this is all anxiety-ridden without talking to the parents, without having the school nurse, if we have permission, calling the doctor. Because time and time again, I've seen, especially in our students who struggle to communicate conventionally, that there's an underlying medical reason for some of these physical symptoms, and that's being missed because they're not able to tell us how they feel. And so if you're seeing some of these physical symptoms, I would urge you to talk to parents, to have the school nurse contact, if you have a release, have the school nurse contact their doctor, because there's been too many times that I've seen an underlying medical condition. And in this, especially if you're female, in this society, we're jumping to anxiety right away before medical pieces, and we don't want to make that assumption either. So you have to be having some good communication. I just was called in, I think 2 years ago, to a high school student, transitioned to the high school from middle school, was itching like crazy, had a huge flare-up in his eczema, they thought, and wasn't going to class, having a lot of outward behaviors. Everybody assumed, they brought in another consultant, she was talking about it being anxiety-ridden. They were doing all these supports around anxiety. I came in and I was like, why did we jump to anxiety? He's itching until he bleeds. It ends up he had a rare form of cancer that caused him to itch. So I have seen it too many times to not put that caution out there. So just because these are signs and symptoms of anxiety, make sure you're having those conversations with the team, especially if they're a child who struggles to communicate in the conventional form. So some signs of long-term stress could be fatigue, headaches, migraines, nausea, stomach pains, neck, back pains. If you're seeing some of these in your students, then you might want to bring up, hey, is anxiety playing a role here? Do we have to talk about this as a team? Some other techniques you can use besides just watching for students, oftentimes I will have students fill out a Google form, like a distress level form, throughout their day. I have parent copies, I have student copies and teacher copies, so you can rank the students' distress level in each class. Parents can rank it on the way to school, on the drive to school. I would suggest making a rubric to determine what that child looks like as their anxiety climbs, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, so it's a little bit more objective versus being super subjective. But sometimes when you have a kiddo not coming to school and you're suspecting it's anxiety, you don't have that privilege. So just to make a 5-point scale can work in and of itself without the rubric until you get to know the student more, what they look like as they get anxious. For kiddos who maybe need more visuals to communicate and to understand language, the 5-point scale is a really nice tool that they can learn pretty easily. It's very visual, that they could either point to 1 through 5 to tell you where they fall in that anxiety scale or distress level, or the people that are with them, the adults in the environment, could rate them if they're unable. And after a couple weeks of data, you guys could take a look at that and see whether or not you need to be providing some supports around anxiety. Okay, so we're gonna jump into some instructional practices. Studies of universal prevention strategies in school have revealed that if we put in some certain instructional strategies, that can have a reduction in anxiety for all people and have a really positive, beneficial effect on students who exhibit anxiety. So not only is it gonna help your students who have a diagnosis of anxiety or autism, but it's gonna help all the kids in your class. The number one, I guess I'm gonna have to say one of the top 2 intervention strategies that I would say is really focus on your relationships with your students. Just by seeing your safe person, just by having somebody in your environment that you consider safe, that you have a strong relationship, that actually activates the vagus nerve, which will activate your calming system and make you feel calmer. So relationships have to be a priority for us in the school setting, for all of our students, but especially for the kids that are have more vulnerable nervous systems, kids who've experienced trauma, kids on the autism spectrum, students who have anxiety. We need to be making sure we focus on building a relationship with them. Also, everybody talks about teaching students to self-regulate. The beginning process of self-regulation is to learn to co-regulate with another person. Developmentally, that comes first. Co-regulating with using another person to help you regulate. Seeing somebody who's calm will actually calm you down. So it's important when you have that relationship that as your student starts to escalate, you're really conscientious of remaining calm and regulated yourself so that student can use you to co-regulate. Really, sometimes I wonder if self-regulation even exists because we all use another person to co-regulate. We all do. If we get upset on our way home from work, we call our friend, we call our mom, we call our husband or our significant other. We're using other people to help us co-regulate all the time. And so by giving students that experience, we will be setting up the foundation for self-regulation, if that even exists, because I have a hard time. Well, I mean, I think it does a little bit, but we all rely on other people to self-regulate. And so to do that also, to build relationships, you can really work on empathizing with your students. I don't care if they need more visuals to understand language or if they have severe deficits in language comprehension. There's been a gazillion times I've seen somebody crying or extremely upset that people would assume don't understand language very well, and I've said, wow, Shelley, you look really scared right now, or wow, Shelley, you look really sad right now, and you can almost see their whole body calm down, relieve some of that tension. It doesn't matter who you are. That kind of empathy is going to absolutely help calm you down. So naming their emotion, which will, over time, help them learn what emotional vocabulary sounds like and what it is, what the words mean. Validating their feelings, empathizing with them, sitting with it for a while, telling them you're sorry, and how can I help you, is gonna be a really good way to build relationships. Also making sure they have predictable time to have connections with other people. If you make it more predictable, it's gonna be less stressful for somebody on the autism spectrum disorder. So maybe at the beginning of class you say, hey Johnny, I'm gonna check in with you in 5 minutes and see how you're liking what we're doing in class today. Then you go over, you check in on them, you say, I'm gonna check on you again in 10 minutes. and you make that a really predictable routine for that student. Also, for students who rely more heavily on visuals to communicate, I've done topic rings where you take a picture of things that they love, things that they have at home, their pets, their family. You make a little script on the bottom so that they can go up to people and share those visuals if they can remember them and if they can learn those scripts and say what's on the script, that's great. If they can't, the communication listener can read it and they can have a little positive exchange and positive connection by having those visual supports. The 2x10 rule is another strategy that you could use. For 2 minutes every day, for 10 consecutive days, you're gonna just connect with that student around something that they love, around their passions, around their high interests, so that it's not gonna be about school, it's not gonna be about demands, it's not gonna be about what's coming up, it's just gonna be about something that they love. And for a student with autism, I would probably do that at the same time every day, so it becomes predictable. And by doing that, you can really strengthen your relationship. All right, there is a saying in neuroscience that says neurons that fire together wire together. And so we do not want a student going into the fight-flight response routinely over and over and over again, because that neurological pathway gets stronger every time it's activated. And every time it's activated, it becomes stronger in that part of the brain. They've even shown that students who experience trauma at a young age, which a lot of people are saying students with autism have brains similar to somebody with post-traumatic stress syndrome, just because living in this world can be very stressful for them. So that downstairs brain gets bigger over time the more it's activated. That neurological pathway gets stronger. So prevention is going to be super important. It's the same system that's activated when we're in chronic pain. That's why the doctors tell us, like, stay on top of your pain. You want to stay on top of your pain because you don't want that pathway to fight, flight, fight to get stronger. So think about it in the same sense as that. So sit down with your teams if your student can't participate. Rank the level of anxiety based on certain situations that they're in. And if there's little things that you can prevent, if the child's able to have that conversation with you, have them fill out a anxiety hierarchy, use an anxiety thermometer to tell you what situations are the most anxiety producing for them, what are the least. I can guarantee you there'll be some you'll be able to avoid. And while I don't promote avoidance for anxiety, there are some things that we can let go of that will help our student prevent those triggers. An example, my own daughter has a very strong fight, flight, fight system. Totally typical little girl, but she has a medical condition that makes her fight, flight, fight system stronger. So when she goes into school late, which we're late often, but when she goes into school late and the secretaries say, Addison, I'm gonna walk you down to the office, walk you down to class, instantaneously that triggers a fight, flight, fight system. So we've just put a part of her health plan that I can walk her down, and nobody will say that to her. Because even if they say that to her and she says no and she knows she's able to say no, that still promotes that fight, flight, fight response. So we want to eliminate that on these little tiny things whenever we can. And so by having that discussion, you can start talking about how do I prevent some of these triggers that are preventable, that we can just let go of. All right, you also, in the school setting, it's really important that we don't let avoidance take over when it comes to anxiety. People can respond in different ways to anxiety. They can avoid it, which is just avoiding that thinking about the anxiety, avoiding the situation that makes them anxious. That's why you have some kids. I have a kiddo in 8th grade right now who is absolutely refusing. He's anxious about anything, but he's sitting in a room by himself the whole day, avoiding going out into the classrooms. He definitely has some underlying anxiety about going to class, but he won't even admit it because he wants to completely avoid that feeling. Or if somebody makes you go into the situation that's anxiety producing, or you decide to do it, you might white knuckle it, which is when you avoid the feelings and your body is super tense, you start clenching your jaws. From that experience, you don't learn that while it was scary, it was still safe because you're still avoiding the feelings. What we want to do is teach kids to kind of live on the edge. You want to walk up to the edge, but you don't want to fall over. You don't want to get flooded with that overwhelming feeling of anxiety. It might happen. We can't always prevent that. And if flooding does happen, then we want to comfort the student and be supportive and help co-regulate them. But we want them to walk up to the edge, face their feelings, and then go back and relax and do something relaxing, do something that they love, and get distracted back into their setting. We cannot push. I mean, a great analogy is somebody who's afraid to swim. We can't throw them in the deep end and say, hey, good luck, go at it. And we can't let them continually avoid to go in water, because that will just tell their brain at a subconscious level, this is really a scary thing. Nobody's even making me go in because it's so scary. So what we need to do is meet students where they are, provide the scaffolds and supports so that they can be successful, and slowly start increasing that time that they are in the situation that produces anxiety. So let's say you have a student who's avoiding music. A lot of reasons why that could be. Maybe it's a really noisy environment and noise hurts them. Maybe it's all the people in usually music rooms are really big, and so that space could be overwhelming. You want to brainstorm some of those reasons and give them supports to be able to be successful in that environment. But to start, perhaps you just videotape from their perspective, walking down to the music room, the classroom teacher waving. You let them do that for about 15 minutes, or 50, I'm looking at my time. You picked up your clock and I was like, oh no. You want to do that for a couple weeks. And then start having them walk down to the classroom and then go back to do something that they enjoy. Start having them walk to the classroom and wave to the teacher. You want to, and this is all going to be a completely individual decision, but you want to make sure, A, it's successful when they experience it, if at all possible. So you want to really be talking ahead of time about what scaffolds and supports to provide to make it successful, and you do not want to push them into it so that they get flooded with that anxiety. That's not going to help us. And avoiding it isn't going to help them either. The longer somebody avoids a situation, the scarier it becomes, and the more that anxiety is reinforced. Predictability. I'm going to have to start talking really fast. Predictability is one of the best things we can do for anybody with anxiety. Make the world more predictable for them. That could be with daily schedules. That could be with mini lists if they have a task that they have to do. Try and think about these 4 questions that you can answer for them. What do I have to do? How long do I have to do it? What am I going to do when am I finished, and what am I going to do next? If you can answer those 4 questions in every situation, you're going to make the world much more predictable for them. Waiting is one time that I think is really hard for people. Like, how long is this wait going to last? I mean, we can set a timer if we know, but if we don't know, it can be really hard to provide structure around that. So I have an example. So I kind of made my own wait, well, this is from the Picture Exchange Communication System, a wait card, but I added time markers to it, so then the staff can have bingo chips in their pocket, and if you don't know like how long it's going to take to get through the lunch line, you can randomly just be putting your bingo chips on the wait card, and then when you know that your student's going to get up to the front of the line, you put the last one on and say, we're all done waiting. So you've made wait much more concrete. It's one of the times I see a lot of kids really struggle with anxiety is when they don't know how long they have to wait. Also, if you don't have a daily schedule, which I would say have a daily schedule, but some people don't have a daily schedule for students with autism. At minimum, I think you have to at least, if they're a student who doesn't know how to tell time, has a struggle with time, you have to at least provide a visual to let them know how long they're going to be in school. Because the passing of time can be really anxiety producing if you don't know when something's going to end. So we've broken down the time of the day into 30-minute increments and just simply moved an arrow down by 30-minute increments. That could be one way to provide predictability around an end of the day. Because again, if you can't visually see when the end is coming, that's going to be really anxiety producing. Okay, some bottom-up approaches to support anxiety. This is really using the body to ease your mind. And so for your students who maybe have more difficulty cognitively understanding some of the supports that we want to provide, we can do some bottom-up strategies. Also, there's a ton of research in positive psychology now that says the more time you spend being calm, the less time you're going to be anxious. And so we can probably decrease anxiety just by giving them more and more time in calm situations, in times that they're happy. Promoting happiness and learning strategies around how to be happy is another way you can decrease anxiety instead of working on some of those cognitive behavioral therapies around anxiety. So here is a Shake It Up game. It's a mindfulness game by Susan Kaiser Greenland. You can do it online, or you can have the actual class play the game. She has a tool called Mindfulness Games, and in it, it's a box of cards. You pull out the card, and Shake It Up is one card, and you can teach your class how to play the Shake It Up game. Shaking your body can release some anxiety in a very safe way, especially like changing up the patterns of how fast you shake, going from being still to shaking, slow shaking, fast shaking. That will help release anxiety in your body. I'm not going to play the video for time's sake, but it's on YouTube. Shake It Up Mindfulness Games by Susan Kaiser Greenland. I would say if you have a student who can play the game with the class, just do this game for your whole class. People love it. We did it in a mindfulness training I just did 2 weeks ago in Madison. We did it as adults and we loved it. And so shaking your body can really release some anxiety. Cognitive breaks. So these are more than just a sensory break, more than a movement break. Just leaving the classroom doesn't get you out of your head. You have to stop some of the worries in your brain and some of that negative self-talk that happens in anxiety. You have to be really engaged in something in a way that gets you out of your head. So Sudoku puzzles, crossword puzzles, reading out loud is a great strategy. Have them make like books for kids that are struggling with reading, so they can read books out loud and put it on tape for other kids. You can't really think when you're reading. You can't be having all these negative self-talks going through your head. For kids who maybe struggle more with language and understanding language, I have found some of these sensory tasks that I've made super calming and organizing for them. So you have to go through that bucket and find all the heart stones. Heart stones are real things, like stones shaped into hearts. And you have to dig them out with a spoon and put them in a box. Students who struggle with understanding language, that's set up in a very visual way so they know exactly what they need to do and they don't have to rely on your language. Creating a mandala, so imitating what that visual card says with all the pieces nice and organized, can be super calming for somebody and help get them out of their head. You can also, for some of those kids who struggle with language, give them time in their high interest. That's not a waste of time. Give them breaks to be doing the things that they love, because that's going to increase those happy hormones in their brain. It's going to give them more time being calm and happy, and that's less time being in fight, flight, and anxious. This used to be called Me Moves, but now they've renamed it to Calm Connect. This is actually an online program that you can get. There's about 3 to 5 minute motor sequences that you imitate. It doesn't matter if you imitate it correctly, it just matters that you try. And that activates the calming system of your autonomic nervous system. It's actually based on Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory. It's really scientifically backed. And so by doing these, I've got a lot of teams that say the only time this kid is calm is when they're doing Me Moves or Calm Connect now. They just renamed it. And I'm like, do more of it, because the goal is to make that calming pathway in your brain stronger than the fight flight. You want to make sure that that neurological pathway is really solid. So giving them time doing something like this is going to be really beneficial for the whole class, but really beneficial for your students struggling with anxiety. Okay, some top-down approaches. I have a minute. Can I go 5 minutes over? All right. For middle school, I love these anxiety and stress cards and growing happy cards. Like I told you, I have that little boy who is struggling, well, 8th grade boy, he's not little, struggling with anxiety. He's completely removed himself, sitting in a room by himself. I'm afraid he's gonna start to become really sad, because you can't isolate yourself for long without becoming sad. So we talked about just doing a tip of the day. This isn't about him. It's about when he does, we can put it on his board in his classroom now, but when he gets back to class, all the middle school students are going to have a tip of the day to like talk about and explore around one of these decks of cards. That's going to help the well-being of all your students, even though you're specifically doing it for one in particular. So these are some really great resources by Christopher Willard, I think, and Judith. Let me look at my notes. But both of them are on Amazon, and they're really practical ideas. One that stuck with me is telling yourself when you're anxious, how much will this matter 1 week from today? I'm a little bit more of a worrier than the average person, and so that's really helped me tell myself and give myself like some of that self-talk. Will this really matter to me in 1 week? So you can, I'll leave these up here for the people here, and we can pass those around. So that can be really helpful. And then developing some positive self-talk scripts. For students with autism, you really want to make these visual. You want to be practicing them when they're calm, not when they're anxious, because really, when you think about it, anxiety can affect learning and memory so much, because as soon as they're anxious, that upstairs brain that helps you learn and helps you remember and helps you rationalize and problem solve, that goes offline. And so you don't want to be teaching these things during times when they're anxious. You want to be teaching them when they're calm. You want to be practicing so it can become flexibly known. And so you really want to teach them that their thoughts lead to their emotions, and that leads to their action. And so here's just an example of the same situation, two different ways you could think about it, and how that will lead to different emotions and different actions. The other visual there, you can add physical sensations to your little script if you want also. So if you have a thought that makes you more anxious, your heart is going to start racing. Your hands might start sweating. You can add that column in if you want also. Use what we know about students with autism and their learning style. Role play this, throw it on a video, let them watch it. Anytime you can put something on a video versus role playing, you're going to get more bang for your buck, because the evidence is really strong that by watching it, they're going to learn faster. All right, challenging those errors in thinking. Martha talked about this a little, but people with autism often have negative errors in thinking that cause them to feel anxious, like black and white thinking. A student might get a test in front of them and say, I can't do this, instead of, maybe I can do a little bit of this, but some of it might be hard. They just go straight to all or nothing type thinking. And so we want to start challenging those. They might be using words like everything, never, always, forever, instead of sometimes or today. And so what we can do is give the kids replacement thoughts for some of those all or nothing thinking. So let's say they said, I can't do this today. You can teach them, well, some of this test might be hard for me and some of it may not be, but I can do a little bit. Or you might have them rank their perception before the test of how hard they might think it's going to be. After the test, if you can get them to do it, rank how hard it actually was, and over time use that data to challenge their thinking. Like, yeah, you thought this test was going to be, you thought this math was going to be hard. For 2 weeks I tracked it and you thought it was harder than it actually was. And try to set up systems that will challenge those thoughts for them. Also, listen to their language and rephrase it. So if you hear somebody say, nobody ever wants to play with me, you could change that and say, oh, Johnny didn't want to play with you today, but Annie did, and kind of reframe their thinking to be more optimistic. Or let's see, another one, I'm not going to understand this, to you're struggling to understand this today. Not that they're always going to struggle, but today they might be struggling to understand this. You still want to acknowledge how they're feeling, but rephrase it into a more optimistic viewpoint. You also want to provide replacement thoughts. I've sat down with kids and over time you will start to learn their negative self-talk because they often say it out loud. But if they don't, you can say, hey, what are some of the thoughts that you have going in your head, around in your head? And many students that I work with are super honest. Like, nobody likes me, nobody cares about me. I'm no good at anything. And then set up a visual, make it really concrete. Something as simple as a T-chart. Here are your unhelpful thoughts. Here's how we can replace them. But again, you have to practice them proactively over and over and over again so that they get integrated into their system and their mind. Because if you're only bringing it out when they're anxious and doing it, your progress is going to be very, very slow. So you want to make sure you're catching them when they're in a good place. So challenging your anxious thoughts. Nobody ever plays with me, to Johnny didn't play with me today, but Annie did. I'll never make friends, to I can't really tell what's going to happen in the future. Really learning some strategies to challenge themselves when it comes to those negative thoughts. And then the end goal is to really teach some self-awareness, because you want the children to know and learn how they feel as they're climbing that anxiety scale. So There's always going to be low-level signs of somebody being anxious, and that's when we want to catch the students and teach and have them start using their coping strategies. And so to start, you might be like, oh, you're rocking more and your hands are sweating. Those are signs that you're climbing the anxiety curve. Those are signs that you're starting to get anxious. You're modeling that talk for them. I've even sat down with kids and just created this chart with them, like some kids have really good awareness, like here's how I feel as I climb the anxiety curve, and then have them brainstorm with you if they can, what strategies they're gonna use to calm them down. If you have a student that can't communicate that very well, use your team to talk about what that student looks like as they climb the anxiety scale and what supports we're gonna offer for them to teach them to calm down, because you have to catch it early. Once it gets to fight flight, there's really not much you could do anymore to calm them down. I mean, then it becomes, if they become aggressive in those stages, that becomes about keeping everybody safe. If they've shut down, there's not much you can do to get to them at that point. So you wanna catch it early. You wanna be having these discussions and explaining to the students how they look as they climb the anxiety curve. Here are just a few. A body scan would be a nice long-term goal, like, hey, do a body scan. You can start by that by checking in is an awesome book set to music by Emily Arrow. I don't know, I'm a huge Emily Arrow fan. She used to be a music teacher and she turns books into songs. But she has one on checking in, and it just goes through your whole body and checking into how it feels. So you could start there. You could also start in the moments of anxiety, labeling what that looks like for the student. The end goal being that you could just say, hey, do a body check right now, and have that student start like just becoming aware of where they are on the anxiety curve and using a strategy to bring themselves down. You can also come up with a calm down routine or a plan. If it's really routine based, you provide a visual of what that looks like. You practice, role play, throw it on a video, let them watch other kids doing their calm down plan. Over time, hopefully, they will be able to start using that and making that their go-to strategy when they start to feel themselves getting anxious. And then I loved this for middle school, the amygdala hijack resource. So teaching them to go over to the amygdala hijack bucket, and when that downstairs brain starts to kick in, these are some strategies that you can use, and have that available for all kids. I mean, my goodness, all of us nowadays are getting amygdala hijack. That's why we have road rage all the time. And so that will help all students. Like if I start to feel anxious, if my downstairs brain is starting to kick in, I can go over to this bucket of amygdala, like this amygdala first aid kit, and pull out some coloring and do some mindful coloring, or doodle, or any type of do a Rubik's Cube, anything that's gonna help calm you down. Now you have to teach the strategies proactively, and you have to be role-playing those and practicing those over and over for them to be able to access it when they're starting to get anxious. All right, I think I'm done.